So when you're at the end of your row, you break the yarn, don't cut it, tear it, about leaving like an inch long tail. And then what you're gonna do is work back 6 or 7 stitches, take out 6 or 7 stitches so you have that 1 inch plus maybe 6 or 7 more inches. And then with your new color, you're gonna, let's see. So then you've got your second color that you want to add in. In this case, we're moving from a black to a white. And so with a regular spit splice, what you would end up with is a little gray area there, and it wouldn't be that abrupt change that you might want. So you've got both of your yarns with about a 3-inch area unraveled. So both plies are unraveled in each yarn like this. And then you're going to take them and overlap them like this. So you're overlapping the 2 yarns after you've unraveled them. And you can see that I'm overlapping the ends by about an inch-ish. It's less important how long it is on the new yarn, and more important that you get it kind of in the right spot on the old yarn where you've measured off that inch. So when you're cutting your yarn initially at an inch, it could be an inch and a quarter, whatever feels comfortable to you, but make sure you sort of eyeball measure it to make sure you've got the right length, that you understand what length it's supposed to be. And then, so when they're crossed over, you want to make sure that the crossover is that amount that you measured initially. In this case, it's 1 inch. If you cut your yarn at 1 1/4 inches, then it would be 1 1/4. So you overlap them with each other like that. And then you're gonna kind of wet your fingers with some saliva and start rubbing the black to the black and the white to the white. And I'll give you a picture of what that looks like.
Done this one.
So that you kind of felt those ends together. It doesn't have to be a lot, doesn't have to be fully felted, but just enough so those ends will all stick together. And you can see where we're going with this now. You've got an abrupt change from black to white. And then you're gonna put them together. And what I like to do at this point is take the place where those 2 separate plies are joined, that middle part, and make sure that's right on top of each other. And any excess looseness or anything on either side will get worked away. So make sure that center is matching. And then put a generous amount of saliva on your hand. And so then once those 2 plies are next to each other, you put a generous amount of saliva on your hand and you rub it all together and you get this result, which is a continuous length of yarn with an abrupt change from dark to light, you know, right where you want it. And then when you reknit your stitches, it comes out right at the end of the row where you want it to be. And you can see that that white begins, I've done a stitch in the black at the end, and then the white is sitting there ready to do the next stitch. So, and even if yours ends up a little bit like off, you can adjust the stitches next to the marker to, you know, pull it to the right spot. But it's a great join because you don't have a lot of ends to weave in, and you get that nice crisp color change that you're looking for in that spot.
Well, here I go. I'm trying it right now.
Yeah, you know, it's worth trying. If it's a little bit fiddly, but it's no more fiddly than weaving in 2 ends in different colors in one spot. if that makes sense.
It's a lot less fiddly than the one that I'd looked up.
And there's also a video of it on our YouTube channel for anyone who needs a little more reminder or likes to stop and start at each step. So for those who weren't here on Wednesday, if you didn't hear yet, the third yarn that we're covering is our Shetlandia yarn, and this is our Shetlandia sport yarn in the M-Sket color. And this is a yarn that, this isn't a brand new yarn for the wool along. This is a yarn that we've had in our lineup for a few years, and we just felt it's a little underappreciated. Maybe a lot of people haven't tried it, or they've tried other brands of Shetland wool and found them to be unpleasant or scratchy, which is, you know, common that people don't care for Shetland, but ours really is nice and soft, and it's very comfortable to wear. So we decided to include it in the wool along, just to give everyone a chance to feel it in person if they hadn't felt it yet. This is our sport weight version, and we have it in 2 weights, fingering and sport. And the fingering weight version comes in 3 solid colors. The sport weight version comes in the same 3 solid colors, plus 3 marled versions that are combinations. Each marled color is a combination of 2 of the solid colors. So it gives you an array of 6 colors in the sport weight that make a beautiful gradient for color work and you know, other projects, or just wonderful solid color projects. It's kind of a heathery, the yarn has heathery tones rather than being, when I say solid, I mean like one color. But it's one heathered color, like you get some dark and light fiber mixed in together, and that always lends a yarn a lot of depth and kind of brings different light into your fabric. It's really nice. So I'm just going to start out with this quote that I like. It's from John Sinclair, and he said this in 1790, that Shetland wool, taking all its properties together, is perhaps the completest article of the kind in the universe, possessing at the same time the gloss and softness of silk, the strength of cotton, the whiteness of linen, and the warmth of wool. So he, you know, among others, felt it was a perfect fiber. The Shetland sheep belongs to the group of, and we've mentioned this before in relation to other breeds, belongs to the group of northern short-tailed sheep, which, and the Shetland is closely related to an extinct sheep called the Scottish Dunface. The northern short-tail breeds are somewhat, a description of the group as a whole is somewhat self-explanatory. They're the northern European breeds, the old primitive breeds that have contributed to the genetics of many, many future and modern breeds. And they are sheep that are largely produced by the landscape in which they exist. So they adapt to a specific or a generally specific topographical and climatic conditions in the region that they're raised. I'm going to show you some pictures of a variety of northern sheep that have contributed to other breeds that we've studied, including the Jacob. You might remember we talked about this a little bit before, and the Gotland, and have contributed to the Shetland breed as well. So let's see. Shetlands are related in part genetically to many of these other breeds. We have some Icelandic sheep, which look like this coming up. So that's the Icelandic sheep. That's, and they are, you know, very similar in body type. Icelandic sheep are a double coated sheep. We're going to talk a little bit about that later, but they actually have a dual coat. And many of these primitive breeds do because of the circumstances in which they thrive. Then there is the, I think this is the Spazlau, this one. This is a larger sheep. Look at that beauty.
Ooh.
You can see how compared to, say, we've done mostly heritage and kind of primitive sheep in this knit along, but for those in Barnbox who were around for the Polworth and even the Frisian is, you know, somewhat more modern than this, but something like Cormo, you can see that those, the modern breeds have a more refined, you know, appearance overall. These sheep, this one is, this is cool because what you see here is, I'm not going to remember the name of this one. This, it's, oh, I think this is the Soa. Did somebody say something?
Your voice cut out just when you said the name.
Oh, I think this is the Soay, S-O-A-Y. And you can see in the back, its little short tail there. We'll talk more specifics about the tail, but this one is in the process of molting its coat, which is so interesting. Some of these sheep blow, like just like a German Shepherd will blow its coat all at once. It'll lose like patches of hair from its undercoat. The sheep will do the same thing. And I've actually talked to like Shetland producers who say they can at times just rip, they can literally just pull the, instead of shearing the sheep, they can just pull its fleece off at a certain point in the spring with a few of their flock, not all of them. So they do sort of let go of their coat at a certain point. It's kind of a characteristic of these more primitive breeds. And then here's the Shetland. I'll show you, I'll start showing you photos of our sheep of the week here. These are Shetland sheep from Shetland that live there. And this is one of my favorite photos because you see all the different colors in one photo. Look at them, how beautiful they are with their different, you can see different markings and different colors all in this one group. I love this photo. Let me bring up another one that's more of a side, more of a profile, so you can get a little bit of a feel for the body type. Here we go. I love this one too. They're so wild looking. They look like they're crossed with antelopes or something. Look at that. Look at the fleece. I mean, this animal lives out in the wild. And look how clean and beautiful and shiny its fleece is, and those markings on its face and everything. It's so beautiful. So the the Shetland breed is a they have adapted to the climatic conditions of Shetland for over 1,000 years, but they are now kept in many parts of the world, not just Shetland. They are one of the smallest British breeds and mainly kept, mainly raised for their very fine soft wool, but also which a very important trait, especially in places where they still are raised in their kind of native environment. They are an important part of maintaining the ecosystem through conservation grazing, which we'll talk about a little bit in detail later. And then also for the high quality of their meat, although the size of these sheep does limit its use, you know, in commercial meat markets, but its meat is highly prized and very delicious. They're small-bodied animals with a little bit of wool on their face, but not like that topping that the Wensleydale sheep had that we looked at last week. They have a little bit of wool on their faces and noses and legs. Their legs are medium length and finely boned. They have small erect ears, and the kind of distinguishing feature of the tapered short tail, it's like a fluke shaped tail, broad at the base at the top, and then tapers to a point with a little hair on it. The tail in a short-tailed sheep is usually 4 to 6 inches in length and has 13 vertebrae. And it actually differs physically from a regular longer-tailed sheep that have, or more commercial sheep that have 26 vertebrae. So it's quite a bit different in length. I think when you talk about a long-tailed sheep, it's a tail that goes down sort of toward the knee instead of staying up high. Rams of the Shetland breed may be horned or hornless, and ewes normally are hornless, but sometimes also will grow short horns that curve a little bit backwards. They are classified as a land race or unimproved breed. We mentioned this a little bit before when we compared the traditional Gotland to the modern Gotland, and also the Jacob sheep as being an unimproved breed. And what that means is that they have been largely left alone to evolve and exist and adapt in their native environments, wherever that might be. In this case, we're talking about Shetland and the Northern British Isles, but if you're raising them in the United States, the genetics are largely not interfered with. You just let them grow and adapt to the environment in which you place them. I'm going to show you a few more pictures. Let's see. This is a winter picture. So they're kind of in their dirty season here, where it gets a little bit muddy, but that's not all dirt. I mean, those grays that you see in some of those sheep, that's not dirt. That's like the color of their coat. It's very beautiful, and you can see. I'm going to zoom in just a little bit on this guy with the stripes that go down toward their eyes, and several of them. You can kind of see that this is a flock that breeds together because the markings are happening in other sheep within this little brood, as opposed to the ones with the circular patches that you might get in a different brood. They are, Janet just said, they're such beautiful creatures. They really, really are. They're so wild and pretty. Here's some really bushy ones. I think these are the ones from Oregon. So these Shetlands are in Oregon in the United States. So you can see that they're thriving. They've got lovely, lovely fleeces, probably getting toward the time when they're going to be shorn, because those are pretty long. And the colors are, you've got a variety of colors from black all the way on the right to fawn and moorit. As with many of the heritage and primitive breeds, one of their features is that the colors in their fleeces are left naturally to evolve. They are not bred to be only white sheep the way more modern sheep are. Okay. The appearance of the Shetland sheep is very similar to the Icelandic sheep, except that they are much smaller in size. And they are not just small in size, but also slow growing. They retain a natural hardiness, a calm and docile nature. They're thrifty, meaning that they use their food very well. And they lamb easily, and they're very adaptable to their environment, and they have long lives. I had a friend who raised Shetland sheep here in Ohio, and she just always marveled at, how compatible they were for her life. She was able to handle them easily. They didn't mind the weather. They they were easy to sort of herd along and do things with. And she always appreciated that, especially after she got into raising some Romney sheep, which are much, much bigger. And she really kind of taught herself a lesson about, about having sheep that she could handle. Shetland ewes are attentive mothers. They milk well and they often produce twins, which, if you think about it, a sheep that exists largely in the wild and in the hill country, it benefits them as a breed to produce multiple births, because the likelihood that one lamb might not survive is higher than in a more coddled environment. Shetland survived for centuries under harsh conditions and on a meager diet. We talked about this with the Gotlands too, that they live in and thrive in areas that are very sparse in terms of nutritious fodder. These are not places where lush, tall, green grasses are growing in abundance. They are having to forage around and eat things that many animals might pass by if they had greener pastures, literally, to move on to. So they also thrive, though, under less rigorous conditions. So even though they're used to a sparse diet that's kind of poor in nutrition, and they can turn that diet into really good meat and good wool, they will also thrive on a better diet. Feeding them richer food won't disturb their digestion in any way. They, like I said before, they produce a very high quality meat with outstanding flavor and texture. And being a primitive breed, the Shetlands store more fat around their organs. So, that's a survival feature of their physical self, I guess. And rather than storing fat in their muscles. So their meat is lean and sweet and highly prized, although scarce. It's not, they're just generally not raised for commercial meat market. They are more of a specialty meat. Forage conversion into milk in Shetland ewes is very good, and really second only to the lion ewes in the UK. So because of this efficiency, the lamb growth is fast, and that's an ideal trait for getting lambs off the mother and onto like a foraging diet. Once the lambs turn to another diet, of course, their growth slows down a little bit, which is what contributes to that, being an overall slow growing sheep. Conservation grazing is, it refers to the use of grazing animals to manage and preserve threatened habitats everywhere in the world, but in Shetland specifically, that includes the heathlands, the chalk downs, unimproved meadows and pastures, and encourages the wildlife that those environments support. Managed grazing prevents those habitats from reverting to scrub woodland and losing their biodiversity. Shetland sheep are ideal for using in these programs because they are extremely hardy. They can get up in the highlands and into little spaces, and They're very self-sufficient and versatile foragers, and they thrive on very low quality grassland and scrub. They're easy to handle and manage, and they don't require large doses of expensive concentrated food in the winter. They can lamb outside without help from humans, and their light build and small feet do less damage to the grasses and meadow plants than a heavier breed would do. So they're very important for that purpose. And I believe it was the Jacob sheep that we talked about were also used for the same thing on, not so much in the wildlands, but on large estates that where you would otherwise have to employ a lot of human labor to do really tedious and unskilled labor. Okay, so because the Shetland Islands are isolated, I'm going to show you a map. So these islands are in the, off the coast of the northern part of Scotland, and are, as you can see, just a whole series of, there's very little large landmass here. It's all perimeter, and the perimeter is full of little inlets and tiny islands that exist all around. It's very much split up. I kind of think of it like the Thousand Islands that bridge New York State to Canada in a way. So I've never been there, so I can't speak firsthand about what it looks and feels like to be there, but several of our participants have been there, and I understand it's just incredibly beautiful. I just want to point out, over to the left in the lower third, there's a little island, kind of one of the larger islands over there, called Fula, and that's an island we're going to talk about a little bit later, that has a kind of subcategory of Shetlands that's kind of special. So, and then this is I'm going to show you a picture of some of the geography that we're talking about here, where these sheep live. It's very coastal. There are a lot of cliff lands. This picture is actually a coastal cliffs on Fula, and you can see the kind of rugged, sparse vegetation that we're talking about. And a lot of the perimeter of the Shetland Islands looks like this: high cliffs, chalky limestone base that doesn't generate really great lush grasslands. And so not only do you have to be really good at foraging and turning poor forage into usable energy, but you have to be light on your feet and able to climb and resourceful as an animal to survive on these landscapes. And not to mention the weather. It's even in summer pretty cold. The winds are high. It's a very kind of wind-whipped kind of environment, which contributes to the type of fleece that they produce. Let's just bring up, this is a really pretty photo. I'll put that up there. I guess some of these photos are large and it takes some time for them to load. So the Shetland, we did study Shetland in one of our clubs back in 2016, I believe. This is an aerial view of Fula, the island. This is in a more temperate time of the year. You can see the beautiful ocean and really just how kind of barren it looks. It's probably spring or early summer in this photo, I would imagine, by the color of the grass. And yet you're just seeing quite a bit of rock and kind of red soil through that grassland. Okay. So we talked a little bit about the different color markings on the sheep when we were looking at some of those photos. And I just want to, just for people who weren't here previously when we talked about it, these sheep produce colors in their fleece. Those are actual pigmentation in the fiber. So there are 11 different colors of Shetland fleece, but then those colors are produced in patterns around their bodies, over their bodies, that also have names. And there are 30 different color patterns that exist for Shetland sheep. And they are related to similar patterns in Icelandic sheep so closely that many of the colors and patterns have names in both the Shetland, the Gaelic, I guess it is, and then the Icelandic language as well. So the Shetland Islands are very isolated, and even now it's very difficult to get to the Shetland Islands. You can really only get there from outside of Shetland at certain times of the year, and transportation to and from is really sparse. So even now, the culture is maintained because of the isolation of the place, and the genetics of the sheep, of the land-raised sheep there, are preserved because, in large part, because of the isolation. So because of that, they managed to escape the kind of mass importation of other British breeds for crossbreeding, and the natural color that evolved in the early sheep was never entirely bred out, as with many of the modern breeds that we have studied. So Shetlands today still show a wide variety of marking and spotting, making their appearance and their fleeces even more interesting. So Shetland colors are known by their traditional names, which, as I said before, are closely paralleled in the Icelandic breed. Now, when we studied this breed in, I believe it was BNK 2017, but it could have been 2016. And those ebooks are available on our website. There's an extensive chapter about Shetland sheep and wool, and full of photos and all kinds of things. There are 2 tables in the chapter, which I unfortunately don't have as a photograph to share, but there's a table of the color patterns and a table of the fleece colors. So the color patterns are the fleece colors, and the markings are the patterned coats. So we have, our line of Shetland represents only just the tiniest number. We have Morit, we have white, and we have an Emsket gray that we spin up. But there are many, many more. And if you travel to Shetland, or you're buying Shetland wool from other places, you may find that the colors are marked even more extensively, and that you have even more shades to choose from. Now, in most cases, the markings are described the way they appear. So the same marking could be white patches on a colored background, or colored markings on a white background. But according to this, Dr. Edelsteinson, who's an expert in Shetland color genetics, color markings in the sheep are only of one kind: white patches on colored background. So in other words, even though even though a sheep may be largely black with white, or largely white with black circles around its eyes, the actual color growth is really more like a black sheep with a really big white patch. Does that make sense? And we talked about this before in terms of mohair wool, and also I believe the Jacob wool, that sometimes the appearance of the sheep is not exactly what its genetic markings are technically. That doesn't really necessarily have to matter to us, since none of us are studying this in super depth. I'm just really geeky, and I love those little facts about sheep. And so if I come across something interesting like that, I like to share it. Of the 30 marking patterns that Shetland have, they share names with about 50%. They share about 50% of their names with the comparable counterpart in Icelandic, despite the fact that there's a breed separation there of 11 centuries. So it's these, in other words, Icelandic sheep and Shetland sheep separated in their breed distinction 1100 years ago, but they still maintain some of the same names in terms of the color markings on their bodies. And that is not just a hint, but an actual documentation that these two breeds came from the same place at one point and were bred as the same sheep, at least 11 centuries back. The names of the markings in both Iceland and Shetland originally came from the Norwegian language. So that leads geneticists, animal geneticists, to believe that the genetics of both breeds go back to some of the really old Norwegian breeds. At the time of settlement in Shetland and Iceland, those names probably would have still been used in Norway because the sheep in both countries came from there. However, the color names and the marking names that are used in Shetland and Icelandic to this day are not used anymore in Norway. So that is probably because the introduction of the white-coated British breeds during the 19th century kind of messed up any of those primitive genetics that had been preserved up until that time. So as the British breeds were brought into many parts of Europe and diluted the genetics of the primitive breeds, so the names that went along with those breeds and their markings went with that. As the European breeds became whiter and whiter, there was no use for those old color names anymore, and so they fell out of use. However, in Shetland and Iceland, they are maintained because the specific breed genetics are maintained in those places. And that's largely due to until recently, almost entirely isolated environment that the sheep are raised in. So the Northern European group of horned short-tailed breeds that the Shetland belongs to includes the Faroe Island sheep, the Norwegian Spelsau, Swedish short-tailed sheep, Finn sheep, Icelandics, Romanos, as well as some of the old northeastern, like Polish breeds and German breeds. They have a more organic evolutionary story than the majority of sheep populating the earth. and even more so than many of the heritage breeds that we've looked at before, like the Lincoln sheep and the Romney sheep, and trying to think of some other ones that we've done. Even Wensleydale, those sheep breeds occupy kind of a mid historical place in the genetic heritage of sheep in general. The Northern European sheep are really back there in the early days and generating a lot of genetics that go on to diversify into other breeds that, as humankind moved into the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, sheep, the need for wool and textiles overall began to grow, and so sheep began to be raised for multiple purposes. So this group of short-tailed sheep is the predecessor of that group of sheep, and because of its hardiness and its longevity, this group of sheep produces a lot of really useful characteristics to lend to those future breeds. Archaeological evidence indicates that primitive sheep were kept in Britain by early Neolithic farmers over 4,500 years ago. Horns of the Soay sheep have been excavated from a prehistoric site called Jarlshof on Shetland, and some color markings found in Shetland suggest genetic contributions from the Soay and Mouflon types. Up until the Iron Age, which is between 1200 BC and 600 BC, sheep throughout the British Isles, as well as Northern and Western Europe, were small, horned only in the male, and variable colors. Excuse me. Norwegians settled in Scotland and the Northern Islands sometime between 500 and 900 AD, likely bringing their own sheep to add to those Soay and other native types. Shetland share many similarities with the Spelsau and Velsau sheep of southwestern Norway, as well as with Icelandics. Wild sheep living on the small islands off the west coast of Norway have the double coat and markings similar to the Shetland sheep of Fula. Sheep brought to Scotland by Viking settlers added to the genetics of the native sheep, and over the next 1,000 years, the harsh climate of Shetland molded and changed the breed into a small, hardy animal that could survive and thrive in the rough weather on scarce resources. Weaker bloodlines died out, and the sheep evolved to become small, thrifty, easy birthers. Short-tailed sheep were still present in the Northern Isles in 1200 AD, although crossing with long-tailed Roman sheep was producing distinct varieties. The Scottish dun-face, for instance, once the main sheep type throughout the Highlands and islands of Scotland, died out on the mainland in the late 1800s. Its remaining descendants limited to a few islands. I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm getting my pages mixed up. So the dun-face died out late 1800s, and with a few surviving on some of the more isolated islands, including Shetland, where it had established itself as a distinct variety. Crossbreeding, was limited because of transportation, for one thing, probably the biggest reason, but also because it posed other hazards and threats to the native sheep populations. In the late 1700s, a sheep scab epidemic was introduced because of crossbreeding experiments. It devastated flocks throughout Scotland, including Shetland, which greatly reduced the availability of high quality wool in that region. At the same time, meat breeds of sheep were moving through the area, through the northward, through Scotland and into the Northern Islands. And so the changes introduced by attempting to crossbreed had a negative impact on the quality of much of the wool that was being produced in Shetland, which in such an isolated part of the world, it really upsets the balance of the products that are produced. So while it seems like a great idea to produce more meat on sheep in those areas, if that becomes your main goal and wool is a secondary goal, then it's throwing off the balance of wool that's available for textile making, which clothes are just, are almost as important to people as foods. So in an isolated place, the impact of that just becomes greater. So as new breeds developed and replaced the primitive ones in more populated areas, their survival of the short-tailed sheep was restricted to these very isolated places like Shetland and Iceland, where they continued to distinguish themselves from their predecessors. Kind of what I said before is that while the genetics of the northern sheep contributed to many of their breeds, heritage breeds even that we've studied, there were still continued to be places where the very primitive breeds survived and thrived and were necessary due to the isolation of those places. In addition, there's an oral history suggesting that Shetland herders may have directly or indirectly been breeding for soft and fine wool from very early on. The Shetland wool industry kind of waxed and waned in response to political and market forces, but managed to still maintain its reputation for superior wool and lace work. Historically and to this day, sheep play a really important and intrinsic role in the trajectory of Shetland culture, industry, trade, agriculture, and now environmental conservation. In return, the habitat and the geographical isolation produces and maintains a distinct and significant breed of sheep. Early in the 1900s, a concern kind of arose that Shetlands, with their colored wool and small size, couldn't compete at market with mainland sheep. So that led to some attempts in the early 1900s to crossbreed with mainland meat sheep and selection program for white wool over colored wool, which of course threatened the wool quality and the future of the native island sheep. So here you have this small sheep thriving on this in this very isolated place. It's a long wool sheep that produces a very fine fleece, in some cases as fine as silk or as fine as Suri alpaca, much finer than merino. So it's producing this excellent wool, but for some reason we need to crossbreed it for other, better qualities, and in the process we're, kind of biting ourselves in the foot to because the wool quality is going to be compromised by that. So in 1926, the Shetland Flock Book Society formed to protect the pure Shetland wools and to keep the Shetland competitive. They had their goal was to create a niche market of specialty wools that would only be produced by pure Shetland sheep, and thus keep their sheep competitive with all of those other more hardy, generic. When I say hardy, the Shetland is a perfectly hardy sheep, but all of those great big meat producing sheep. This coincided with a famous kind of stroke of luck when the Fair Isle sweater came into fashion. Cottage knitters on the island took advantage of the range in natural colors to create a demand that has never really died out. You know, the cottage industry of knitting in Shetland is in itself fraught with, you know, all kinds of angst, but it did contribute to the survival of the Shetland breed as its own unique, isolated and you know, purebred breed. By the 1970s, the characteristics of Shetland sheep kept by the UK breeders in the rest of Britain varied so widely in conformation and fleece quality that that the mainland sheep began to consistently, they were making progress with making the mainland sheep breed, the Shetland breed on the mainland, closer and more consistent with what was produced within the Shetland Flockbook Society. And since then, mainland breeders who adhere to the tradition have maintained a single coated phenotype sheep that produces the expected fineness in wool. And actually in our Shetland yarn, that's the wool that we use to spin our Shetland yarn. So we're not able to obtain Shetland wool from the Shetland Islands, but we are able to get British Shetland that conforms to the breed standards for wool of the Shetland sheep, of the true Shetland sheep. Still, even in the 1970s, demands for white coated sheep that produce a generous carcass for meat were still high. And at the same time, right around then, there was kind of a waning interest in Shetland wool products. And so even on Shetland, the flock numbers began to decline. By the time the Rare Breed Survival Trust was set up in the 1970s, Shetland sheep had become one of the rare breeds. And in 1977, the Rare Breed Survival Trust placed the true Shetland sheep in Category 2 class, endangered. So that led to some attention and purpose being paid to improve the flock numbers on the island of Shetland of the true Shetland sheep. And by 1985, which is really a short time between 1977 and 1985, they didn't let that go too long. You know, the popularity of the breed had recovered, even on the mainland, and especially for smaller farms interested in producing colored fiber, which was beginning in the 1980s to be a thing. So those smallholders began breeding for color and for more true Shetland traits, and the fineness of the wool improved again. And by 1985, the Shetlands were reclassified as a Category 5 above numerical guidelines. At that time, the Shetland Sheep Breeders Group was formed to monitor the status of the breed once they were recovering from the rare breed status. And then in 1990, they started their own flock book for registering Shetlands. And this is a group that exists in the mainland, UK mainland. concurrent with that, the North American Shetland Sheep Association was formed to handle registrations in North America. By then, Shetland classification was revised to a minority breed, which is still a breed that exists in very small numbers, but is not in any way threatened or endangered. And they were removed from the Rare Breed Survival Trust as a supported breed by 2002, which is all good news for people who love Shetland and Shetland sheep. Today, the breed on the UK enjoys healthy numbers and a high conformation to the breed standards, but still the numbers are surprisingly small, especially when compared to other modern breeds and kind of mid breeds. In 2011, on the mainland in Great Britain, just 2,244 sheep were registered by 196 breeders, which, you know, isn't a lot. And only 38 rams were approved under the Shetland Sheep Society approval scheme, which is the strategy that they use for breeding. So just like with the Wensleydales that we talked about last week, you can register your Shetland sheep, but only under very strict judging guidelines can a ram pass to the point of being a breeding ram. So of the 2,244, there are just 261, I'm sorry, there are 134 rams and 261 ram lambs, and only 38 of those rams are approved for breeding. So they have to be the kind of rams that get around. The majority colors of those rams are Morat brown, white, black, and gray. And the marking being the most common is the cat mugget, which I have to look up. I'm sorry. I have to look at my chart to see what that actually means. Here it is. That is a light colored body with a dark belly and Moget facial markings, which are brown to yellow facial markings. Okay. Now, in North America, the North American Sheep Breeders Association was formed in 1994 to promote the breed here in the United States and to serve a growing number of Shetland breeders in North America. The organization also continues to this day to support the mission initiated by the Rare Breed Survival Trust. So they are serving as a networking organization, as well as an organization that maintains breed standards according to the Rare Breed Survival Trust. While the Shetland breed appears to be recovering in a healthy way, the fact is that the numbers have dwindled so drastically in the very recent past that these breeding associations have a really important role to play in determining and protecting the genetic diversity of the flocks, so that the same genetics aren't being recycled over and over and over again, leading to weakening of the traits of the sheep and also the constitution of the sheep. So they keep the rams breeding in a diverse way, trading semen in different parts of Great Britain as well as the United States, and making sure that the genetic pool is varied as time goes on. Let's see. They're also trying to protect and conserve the entire range of colors and body markings, as well as the fleece types and other characteristics. It's a really important role that they play in terms of making sure not to be exclusive, but to keep things as healthy as possible. So historically, only a few Shetland sheep were ever exported from the Shetland Islands. Notoriously, Thomas Jefferson kept a Shetland ram for several years in the early 1800s. This ram had, unlike most Shetlands, but like some related breeds, this ram had 4 horns. He was kept with about 40 other rams or 40 other sheep on President's Square in front of the White House. But in the spring of 1808, he attacked several other people that were taking shortcuts across the square and injuring some of them and killing a small boy. So the ram was moved to Monticello, which is Jefferson's, large rural estate, and incorporated into a small flock of Shetlands that he kept there, where it was eventually killed because it ended up killing several other rams. So Jefferson reportedly described this animal as his abominable animal, though that kind of aggression is actually not normal in Shetland sheep. They're usually really docile and friendly and easy to manage. But, if I had to live on the front lawn of the White House, I might get cranky too. A couple of other small importations to the United States occurred in the late 1800s, but none of those flocks survived as purebred populations. By 1921, it was recorded that Shetlands could not be bought in the USA, pure Shetlands. And not until recently were any larger populations established, even on the British mainland. So they were imported here during the 1800s, but then so quickly diluted that within really not very long, you couldn't actually pinpoint one that was a purebred. Larger numbers of Shetland sheep came to North America in 2 important importations. First in 1948, which was a Canadian named George Flett brought a large number in, and then his flock was apparently almost forgotten until the 1990s, when, after evaluating the sheep, and quite a bit of evaluation by the North American Sheep Breeders Association, they voted to let the Flett bloodlines be registered as pure Shetlands. Other importations occurred in 1980 by Colonel Daly in Cambridge, Ontario, and those 2 flocks are the foundation of the flocks that are being raised here in the United States. Most of the sheep that exist in North America, most of the Shetland sheep, can trace their ancestry to those original 2 groups. So in North America, there are some smaller flocks that are, you know, there are producers that are trying to establish and grow the breed here. Right now, the flocks are small. We always wanted to do, you know, we've been approached a number of times by people with smaller flocks that want to sell us wool, but they don't produce enough for us to create a yarn line or to even enough for a shipment of barn box. And then when we have put these producers in touch with the mill that spins our yarn, they're like, no, you know, they're kind of picky, and they don't want to work with the wool that they've seen here yet. That's not to say that nice Shetland wool isn't being raised, but it's really widespread production of a very small amount. So here and there, you'll find a flock with really nice Shetland. As I mentioned before, I had a friend who raised Shetland sheep, and her sheep produced really beautiful fleece. I bought it many different times for hand spinning and really made beautiful yarn with it. But she had like tops 6 sheep, and this is what you run into with farms with smaller flocks, is that they're just not. They might be doing a really good job on their farm, raising sheep for wool quality, but the number just isn't big enough, and they are small sheep, so you're only getting, you know, 4 pounds or 5 pounds is a really good yield from a small sheep in terms of its fleece. So backing up just a little bit, the primitive sheep and the in Shetland, many of those are the double coated type of Shetland. I'm going to bring up an illustrated graphic here. So Shetland sheep can occur both in the primitive double coated form. They can occur in a single coated form that kind of mimics a double coat, where it has a lot of that kemp that we talked about. And here's a little illustration of all 3 types. The top one is a single coated ewe and fleece. I'm going to zoom in a little bit so you can see a little more closely what that looks like. You can see that the fleece has an all over consistency, and has a little bit of a waviness to it and a nice crimp, but it's very consistent looking. Then we go down to the wavy, what's known as the wavy longer fleece. This is more of a long wool fleece. It's got a straighter, less consistent coat, where some of it is very crimpy and some of it is straighter. You kind of get that mix in there. And this might be a fleece that you would find a little more of that third fiber, the kemp fiber, and maybe even some hair as well, kind of mixed. And then this is the double coated fleece. This is a sheep that has, and unfortunately there's not a good shot here of where you can see both layers, but you've got a top coat that's very straight with practically no crimp at all. And then underneath that coat, there's going to be a puffy layer of undercoat that's very fine. You can kind of see a little bit of it in the corner of this photo. As you peek through that long hair, you can see the lofty undercoat underneath. And we'll get back to a little bit more of the wool qualities in a minute, but that's when I talk about long single coated versus double coated, this is what we're kind of working with here. So so most of the North American sheep are the single coated variety. They are the shorter, they have their coat as a shorter staple length, you know, maybe 6 to 8 inches. It's crimpy wool, and it's kind of all in one. When you shear the sheep, you don't have to separate the fiber in any way. It's all the same fiber. It's consistent. there are a few, of course, double coated sheep with the wavy, hairy outer fleece and the downy undercoat. But most of the ones that are raised here are the single coated type. The wool of both types can range from soft to strong. And while the word strong wool is used for wool that's really not soft enough to wear next to the skin, it does make great outer garments, socks, rugs, and upholstery fabric and things like that. There's probably, there really isn't, there aren't many other breeds that offer such a wide variety of wool within, you know, a single fleece. And for that reason, the Shetland sheep, while being a multi-purpose sheep, its fleece is even a multi-purpose fleece. It has truly like a wide range of uses. The question for breeders really is, you know, kind of where on the continuum do you really want your fleece, your flock to be situated? Do you want it to be a primitive landraised sheep or a more standardized sheep? Purebred Shetlands on the Shetland Islands are considered landrace. They are considered consistent with the primitive characteristics of the breed, and those are maintained, you know, even in modern times. Shetlands on the British mainlands and in the USA are moving toward a more standardized type. Each type, just like we talked about before, just like with the Gotlands, where there are the traditional Gotlands and the modern Gotlands, each type has its advantages and disadvantages. And really, it's really about what the producer can and wants to manage in terms of type of flock. Landrace types require a higher degree of variability, both in the breeding and the environment. Because of their limited numbers, you're going to have to work harder to make sure that the genetic diversity in your flock is maintained and that you're not producing weaker and weaker sheep with too much inbreeding. So that's going to be like a job you have to take on as a breeder. And also in the environment, you need to provide them with the wild forage and the cold, windy climatic conditions that produce that silky, long, soft coat. Similar to cashmere sheep, cashmere goats and Romney sheep is another example. The type and softness of the fleece is actually impacted by the environment and the weather conditions that the sheep live in. And that's why when you know, purebred Gotlands were transported to Australia, the British, the Swedish and British Gotland societies wanted to kind of make sure that they were always distinguished as a separate branch of the breed, because the climatic conditions produce a different type of fleece. So you have the same thing with Shetlands. You know, having flocks in the lower part of the UK and warmer, more temperate, more even terrain, and in the US, similar, produces a different fleece in the sheep and a slightly different meat as well. So the sheep that are kept in the more primitive areas of the Shetland Islands are kind of recognized as landrace. Excuse me, I have a very dry throat. Okay. The other thing you have to consider is, along with the genetics, and it is partly genetic, is that you want to continue a range of fleece colors and markings if you're going to keep your flock in the landrace category. Standardized flocks will produce a more predictable wool product and can be bred for, you can introduce genetics for softness and springiness, but then what tends to happen is that they produce a less appealing range of colors, and they lose some of their other landrace characteristics, such as multiple horns and very lean meat. So just as a producer has to juggle all these things, they also have to deal with a market that's going to determine some of their decision making and and some of the outcome. Just like with heirloom vegetables and other kinds of textiles, market demand is going to drive how the numbers of any particular segment of the Shetland group of sheep are focused on and concentrated on, how their breeding goes. Let's see. Within Shetland itself, encouraging traditions that make use of the entire range of Shetland fleece colors and types will provide a continued niche market for a variety of fleeces in hand spinning, knitting, weaving, sewing, and ready-made products as well. Teaching and sharing those art forms and appreciating the wools of unique character and beauty are all part of the range of products produced by Shetlanders around their beautiful and unique wool. Let's see. Now, speaking of wool, let's talk about the actual wool. Any questions so far? I mean, there's a lot to know about Shetland sheep. I'm trying not to be boring, but there's just so much to know, and overly geeky as I tend to be. But any questions I might be able to answer? Anybody?
Okay. Is this D? Is this the D wool?
This is D, correct.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I love it. I love it.
Yeah, it's really nice and soft and airy.
Anne, can I
Yes.
ask a question?
Yeah.
So in the United States, I'm trying to understand, in the United States, the Shetlands, do they try to manage a lot, or do they do what they do in Shetland, which is just let them roam, and even some farms in Shetland, when they're they don't even manage the population at all, like
Right.
So do they do that here, or is it more managed, and then the food specific so that it's a controlled environment?
I think overall, the larger percentage of US and Canadian breeders are doing a more managed process.
Okay.
So they have kind of settled on a more, how do they put it, standardized,
Yeah.
on producing a more standardized product.
Mhm.
And with the full recognition that you're giving up some things when you do that, like range of color and to some extent wool quality as well.
Mhm.
Because in order to standardize, you have to introduce genetics of more standardized sheep, not Shetlands. You
Yeah.
can't do that with Shetland genetics.
Yeah.
But I'm sure, I mean, I know for a fact that there are breeders here, or maybe you wouldn't call them breeders, but there are small holders here, people who do want to just keep a small flock of sheep that are kind of allowed to do what they want. But what you're introducing there is, a tendency toward inbreeding. So you have to manage, you actually have to manage that You have to make sure that there's diversity in the genetic pool of your small flock, if that's what you're going to do. And even in Shetland, make no mistake, they are managing the breeding of their sheep. They are not letting it, they are not entirely leaving it up to chance, because because even there, with only like maybe 1,500 sheep on the islands or something like that, and all of them living in separate little pockets throughout the islands, they're very isolated. They're still small numbers in very isolated places. So they are managing that. Otherwise, you end up reversing the goal that you're trying to do. You know, you're trying to maintain hang on, Renee. You're trying to maintain you're trying to maintain the characteristics of the primitive breed, but you are but weakening it by overbreeding within the same gene pool is not going to benefit you. So, Renee.
Oh, so animal husbandry. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello?
Yes.
Animal husbandry is part of the nature of that is to make sure that just as with humans, you don't have first cousins or second cousins together. So it's been throughout the centuries, you borrow a ram that hasn't been on your farm for a long time, and then you send it back. And so that is how, that's just a tradition from that's centuries and centuries old to keep your flock strong.
Yeah, and we have talked
And
about that.
that's one reason why rams are sold off for meat very quickly.
And we have talked about that many times through our barn box discussions. And I think it gets back to what I said before about the breed society has this really strict judging process every year where it puts the rams through, it puts all the sheep that all the farmers who want to register sheep go through a process. And if their genetics conform to the flock book standards, they can pass. But then the rams are put through an additional 2 levels of judging that weed out a very large percentage of them. About 90% of the rams are filtered out from being breeding rams. And then those breeding rams are either physically transported from farm to farm, or their semen is extracted and sold in straws, like we talked about with the, I think it was when we talked about the Gotland, that woman that has the rare breed, she has a business importing and selling sheep semen of a variety of rare breeds, and it's and so only the very best rams are kept for breeding, and they are, and you wouldn't use the same ram like 2 years in a row, or if maybe not even 3 years in a row. You would always want to use a different one. And even at that, there are breeders that will bring in genetics from another breed and maintain kind of within their flock a breeding program just to strengthen genetics. So they might bring in a ewe from like an Icelandic ewe or another northern breed, and isolate that ewe and its offspring for several generations until they get back to a 90-something% Shetland offspring. So they, you know, there's always a usefulness to being other breed adjacent as long as you are managing it and not just letting it run its course. Okay, so moving on from the sheep themselves, and there's so much to know, and I encourage you to to dive in on your own. The internet is a fantastic place for getting lost down a rabbit hole. Let's talk about the wool. So Shetland sheep are, really their main, most notable product is their wool. They produce a very soft, well-crimped fleece, meaning that their fiber crimp is quite high and springy. And it is the product around which the Shetland wool industry was built. It is the finest, it has the finest micron count of all the native breeds, with an average fiber diameter of 23 microns. The Shetland fleece is low in weight, like I said before, usually between 2 and 4 pounds, which is interesting because it is consistent with averages throughout Britain 200 or 300 years ago. So over time, the Shetland fleece has not gotten more voluminous or less voluminous. It's pretty consistent. Today, though, with the more standardized Shetland sheep, 5 or 6 pound fleece is not uncommon. On the Shetland Islands, the staple length tends to be between 2 and 4.5 inches, but longer lengths of up to 6 inches are recorded as well. And I want to say it's still, when my friend was raising her Shetlands had even longer fleece than that. Like it was nothing for it to get to be like 7 or 8 inches. But ideally, so she would shear twice a year because of that. Ideally, you want it to be less than 6 inches, if you send it to the mill. So Shetland fibers are of a simple construction. They have a central cortex covered by a thin, scaly cuticle and an average diameter of 23 microns. However, there is a range. The amount of crimp varies, and the crimp determines how much bounce is in the fiber. There's a positive correlation between fineness and crimp. So the finer the hair shaft, the more crimp is able to develop. The wool of the finest quality Shetland is crimped at between 8 and 12 little bends per inch. While it is not known how the fleece of the Shetland sheep developed into such a fine, soft, lustrous wool, a description of selective breeding for fineness of fleece has survived in this document called the Old Statistical Account of Scotland from 1997. Sheep in certain parts of Scotland were constantly attended by a boy or a girl during the day, whom they followed to and from the pasture. They were penned in a house with slatted walls during the night, and these very small flocks were the responsibility of the whole family, and competition existed between the children about who should possess the handsomest and most valuable animal within the flock. This means that animals for future stock were selected on merit long before scientific selection for improvement was invented. It is believed that by those means, the fleece of these sheep was improved to such a degree that their wool was preferred to any other wool then known in the neighboring markets. Later developments in Scotland led to the eradication of sheep flocks of this type, and no trace of these sheep is now found. So that's kind of interesting. It's not necessarily fact, but it's a factual account of behavior of the period. There's a lack of evidence that this process was actually carried out elsewhere, but it's equally likely that Shetland sheep were subjected to that kind of scrutiny and that their wool improved in a comparable manner by just breeding animals with the best wool or the best looking or ones that were the cleanest. As we saw with some of the earlier breeds that we've studied, that in early times, these may have been the way that we got where we are. So the fleece of the short tail breeds, the primitive breeds, is double coated with an outer and an inner coat. The distinction between the outer and inner coat is probably the least pronounced in the Shetlands, the Finn sheep, and some of the Swedish short tail breeds. Shetland fiber varies greatly, ranging from an incredibly fine 15 micron fiber around the neck to a coarser britch wool, which is more like 36 microns. So that's an incredible range of coarseness. Britch wool being just what it sounds like, the wool that's back by the pants, so at the back of the animal. Usually that's the part of the sheep that gets a little rougher treatment. And the higher sheep with standardized, the more standardized characteristics usually have a higher micron count than sheep with the more primitive and wilder characteristics. Landrace populations, i.e. those in Shetland, such as those on the island of Fula, include an even greater range of fleece types. These sheep may be more distinctly double-coated with coarse outer wool of 30 to 40 microns and a finer inner coat of 12 to 20 microns. This diversity is both an asset to the breed and appealing to fiber artists who work with both types of fleece. And I'm going to just show you a photo of the Fula sheep. These are the more wild Shetland types that occur on the island of Fula. Let's see. Now here are some, this is interesting because I'm saying they're the wilder ones, and some of these guys have coats on. So while they are wild, they are kept as well. So they're wild in the sense that they have evolved much more naturally. And you can see that the fleeces on these sheep are straighter and longer. And the one on the right there has this beautiful mane coming out of his coat there. So that's one picture. And let me see if I can get the next one up. These look like they're kind of halfway between shearing season. You can see there's still some snow in the background there. So this might be in early spring, maybe a few weeks after shearing. I know there's probably, oh no, that's not snow, that's water. That's light on the water, actually. They look wild. And then here is another photo of the landscape on Fula where these sheep live in the kind of terrain that they're that the fleece is being propagated on. I mean, it's all rocky like that. Okay. So above everything else, really, the Shetland fleece should be soft. An overly coarse fleece is a serious fault. So fine micron count is super important. And there are 3 accepted types of Shetland fleece. One is the kindly single coated. They call it kindly or single coated. Extremely soft and downy, usually very crimpy and dense. Rues nicely if caught in time. Ruing is actually that process by which I described. You can pull the fleece off the animal kind of in one big piece. That's called rooing, R-O-O-I-N-G. Short staple length, 2 to 4 inches, has a tendency to collect debris, mainly because of its downiness, not because it's greasy. Shetland fleece does not, Shetlands don't produce a lot of grease out of their skin. And the debris is usually easily removed by carding and combing and the normal fiber preparation to make a very soft fiber that's would be fine for next to the skin garments. And let me just see if I can bring up a photo. Oh, it might not let me stop sharing. You might have to stick with that for a bit. Can you hear me okay though? Okay. The second type of coat from that photograph I showed you of the 3 types is the long and wavy coat. This is the kind of average, most typically seen Shetland coat. The fleece length varies from 4 to 6 inches with a slight kind of a wispiness on the ends of each lock. It has a very open quality, which you could see in that photo. You could kind of see through the fleece a little bit. And but the locks on the ends, the locks are you know, can be kind of closed. It spins very easily, and it's nice for worsted wool applications such as fine woven fabrics or knitwear with well-defined patterns that must be maintained, like Fair Isle knitting. And then you have what they call the beaver or primitive or double coated type, which is very long and luxurious. It's usually straighter, but still soft, with lengths of up to 6 to 10 inches and even longer. The ideal double coat has distinct fiber types that can be readily separated. The outer coat is hair-like, while the undercoat is soft and downy. On the hoof, the Shetlands became the foundation animals for virtually all, the Shetlands became foundation animals for virtually all the North American flocks. And most Shetland sheep in North America trace their ancestry back to the original group of Shetland sheep. Today, purebred North American Shetland sheep exhibit a healthy selection of wool types, from short stapled crimpy wools to long wavy and hairy wools with downy undercoats. Wool of both types can range from soft to strong, and while strong wool is not soft enough to wear next to the skin, it does make again a great wool for outer garments. Okay. I think that might be everything. Hang on one second. The nice thing about Shetland wool is that it does have that kind of toothiness to it that makes it really good for color knitting. And also, oh, here we go. I wanted to talk about this. And also for lace weight, in that it blooms a lot, and it has a kind of a slight halo or
I got a question about the pattern. If anybody is doing the square.
Yeah.
On the written instructions, the square stops at row 19, but on the chart, I think I don't have the pattern in front of me. It goes up to 22. Does anybody?
Which clue are you on?
Which clue?
Clue 3.
I'm not that far.
I'm doing that one too, Elizabeth. I didn't notice because I never look at the written instructions.
Oh, yeah, it does.
So I don't know if we were supposed to change color, maybe. She didn't say that. She doesn't say to end color or whatever after the end of the clue, right?
No, she doesn't say the bright color B, so I'm not, I'm
I
gonna,
would check the stitch
Row
count.
20 is a knit row.
She didn't give a stitch count. That was one thing I was
Oh,
little, she didn't give a stitch count at all for clue C. Or
On
for
the
clue
written-
3.
On the
Yeah,
written part of it, if you look up above, row 20 is a knit row.
on the last part of the third clue,
Yeah, on C. Right, yeah,
um,
right before the end.
you're on the, are you doing the triangle or the square?
I'm doing the square and it says rounds 11, 13, 17, and 21, and it gives
Oh.
directions. It says 12 and 22. Oh, it goes 22. 22, and it says this, it says
They're just
round
that
20.
order.
20. So it has up to rounds 22 on the written instructions.
It does.
Yeah.
Oh, it has it at the top. I see it now.
yep.
Yeah,
They're
but
not
it
in order.
doesn't, what it doesn't say is rounds 23 and 20. No, that I'm looking at the different one. Yeah, it says up to 22. So 21 and 22 are shown up above with a bunch of them. 20 are.
Yeah, 12 and 22 are the same.
Got
And
it.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and 11, 13, 17, and 21 are the same. 14, 16, 18, and 20 are the same.
Yeah. I hardly
They're
ever look at the
awesome.
written instructions either, but I'm trying to look at them more because I always seem to, you know how I like to speed read through the pattern and say, yeah.
Yeah.
And then I was just going down. I'm like, wait a minute, where's row 20, 21, and 22? But you're right. Up in italics, it says work
Mhm.
11 through 22. Got it.
Also, I'm assuming that the stitch count would have, well, no, it wouldn't have remained the same.
no, it goes up by 2 each row. So
Exactly.
I think we had 126 on each side at the end of clue 2, right?
Well, hey,
136.
We had
136.
130,
Yeah. So
136,
Yeah,
2,
yeah.
4, 6, 8, 10 on chart C1. So you had 146 at the end of chart C1, and then 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 158. And that's what I had when I finished.
Okay,
100 and how many, hun?
158.
158. Okay.
yeah, that's what I just calculated off of the chart and it would be 158.
Yeah. But
Okay.
I counted too, because, because I'm anal.
And is that all the way after C2, after chart C2, or after chart C1 that you're talking about?
No, C2.
Okay.
C1 increased by 10 each side,
Okay.
and then C2 increased by 12 more.
Okay.
So you went 136, 146, 158.
Okay.
I got a text back from Ann. She says, okay, I'll exit and come back.
I'm here.
and there she
Okay.
is.
Sorry about that. It froze when I tried to get out of that picture. Anyway, is there did you guys have a question about the pattern, or are you just all checking in with each other?
We
We
figured it out.
We figured it out.
Okay.
Once again, I did not read the complete pattern. So,
I have a comment.
Yes.
So if you're interested and you like geeky old movies, there is a movie called Edge of the World. You can Google it on YouTube. It's from the 1937. It's a movie set on Fowler.
Oh, cool.
And it shows really great pictures of them gathering lichen to do the dyeing of the wool, processing the wool. It's got a cute little story too, but it's really worth seeing. And then if you can get a hold of it, they did a documentary in the 70s. The actors who made the movie went back to the island and met with the extras who were the people living on the island. So it's really interesting. It's called Edge of the World. I'll put it in the chat so you can find it. If you can Google it, and it's about an hour and a half movie, and it's like super fun. I watch it at least once a year.
Documentary.
Well, it's a movie, and then there's a document, and then it's like Return to Fowler, I believe, is the documentary. And I know you can buy a DVD with both of them on it, because that's what I have.
I do
Yeah.
have a question. If there's someone who's doing the shawl or the triangle, can I see it? Since I'm doing the square, I don't know what it looks like.
It looks the same.
It looks the same.
Looks the same.
Ah,
It's
okay,
just half
it's
the square.
fine.
Yeah, I have mine. This is what,
And here's mine.
Those are beautiful.
Hard to get it to show because I'm halfway through a row.
Right. Thank you.
I am using mine to cover my legs while I knit. It's going to be big enough to serve as a lap blanket for me. I love it. I'm knitting the square and I'm.
Yeah, square is a good size. It's gonna be like 50 inches square. That's a pretty good size.
Yeah, so it's going to go on the back of my chair when I'm finished with it. And I'm shocked that I'm staying up to date on the clues. I'm on the last row of clue 3. Yeah, clue 3.
Good job.
Hey, Anne, when I was a kid, I had a poster that had dog breeds, all the like AKC dog breeds. Is there somewhere that has like
Yes.
a family tree of sheep or a poster of sheep
You can
breeds?
get, there are so many sheep breeds that they actually have posters that are kind of segmented. So like we have one at the shop that's all the British long wool breeds, I think. And then I have another one that's some other group of sheep, but you just Google it or go on Etsy or go on Amazon, you'll find it. I mean, they have them on Amazon and I got mine from the British Wool Board, you know, a number of years ago. But when they were really trying to, you know, put stuff out, I got a whole bunch of stuff from them that I just had to go online and ask for. I mean, they sent it for free. I got a couple of DVDs and that were documentaries. One is about shearing and another one is about not Shetland wool, but some other maybe a more general wool thing. And a couple of posters, some other little tchotchke stuff, you know, that they sent me to spread the good tidings of British wool. So yeah, easy to get.
Isn't Shetland Wool Week coming up?
I think it's in September, if I'm not mistaken, but I could be wrong.
I
It
saw
might
a
be,
bunch of ads for it, so I.
it might be now because it makes sense. It would be more like in the summer, but Catherine would know, I think, or one of the other women who have traveled there might know.
So
I'll
those-
tell you what, you know, I have more about the wool, but why don't we just save this for Wednesday? Or we can do this Wednesday if you want. Since there's a lot and it's, unless you want me to go back to it now, I feel like you guys have been listening to me drone on for far too long, so, but it's up to you. What do you want to do?
If we save it for
First of
Wednesday,
all,
maybe
it's not
those Wednesday.
optional. I'm loving everything that you're teaching us. And
Okay.
secondly, I think it's getting close to the end. So if you want to wait and finish up Wednesday, you know, we've come back to it, but
Yeah, there's quite a bit left to talk about the wool itself, and everybody might be fresher and appreciate that discussion when they haven't been listening to, you know, 15 other pages of geeky genetics and stuff like that. But
I have a basic question, and that is, somebody asked, but my hearing is really bad. Is the Shetlandia the C or the D? So answer with cat or dog.
it's dog. It's D
Thank
as in
you.
dog. Yes.
Thank you. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, for those who ripped open all their bags and took their yarn out, that's the danger. That's the danger of doing that. You might get them mixed up as you put them back in. But yes, so it'll be the color that you're knitting in section B in the lace pattern. And then yeah, so.
Okay.
Any other questions? Anybody want to ask anything or say anything? I really love that everybody held up their shawls today. So maybe on Wednesday we'll do that again, since probably everybody didn't get to do it. We'll do a show and tell and we'll talk about the wool. And it is technically an off week, so we won't be doing a new clue. It'll just be regular knitting time. And we'll pick it up from where we left off today.
Thank you.
Happy 4th of July, everybody.
That's right. Keep your dogs close, keep them safe. Yeah, our dogs go nuts right
They don't
now.
allow fireworks here anymore, so
Oh,
it's
I wish I
it's-
lived, where do you live?
Los Angeles.
Oh, yeah,
Yeah, but it's not 4th of July really, in a way. But my dogs don't go bananas anymore.
Yeah, they actually,
know,
in Ohio, they relaxed the laws even more last year, and now you can blow off firecrackers. You can blow off fireworks anytime you want, any hour of the day, as
Wow.
much as you want. And they also relax the strength of them. So, just when things are quieting down at like 3 o'clock in the morning or 4 o'clock in the morning, boom, something goes off. People that are still partying at that hour are.
Yeah,
Well,
everybody
there's a lot
here
of
has been
dynamite
setting
that
them-
goes off here.
yeah,
Um,
Everybody
and-
here has been setting them off for 2 weeks. We've been
Yep.
listening to them for 2
Since
weeks.
since Memorial Day, it's been
Uh-huh.
going on.
Yeah.
Yep.
yeah.
Wow. They're illegal here except for the fireworks things. And so what they do here is they line Lake Washington with barges, and then you go down and sit in one of the parks and they do fireworks. And poor Lewis just thinks we're all going to be killed. He gets very nervous, but it's worse if we leave him here without us and he hears it. So,
Yeah.
but they're absolutely beautiful.
Yeah. Yeah.
The only
They
problem
are.
is they start late because the sun doesn't set until like 9:30 or something. So
I have a
Exactly.
neighbor
I
that
live-
sets his off during the day because his grandkids are there. It makes absolutely no sense. But anyway,
Yeah,
That's
well,
okay,
there are apparently daytime fireworks and nighttime fireworks
who
because
knew?
Well, I live in the semi countryside and my horses do not appreciate the fireworks either.
right,
And they don't
Right.
make undershirts for them.
it's it's hard to pick a time of day to go for a walk because you're never really safe. But we're doing our best.
Yes.
Well, thank you very much, Ann. That was great.
Oh, you're welcome. I'll see you guys on Wednesday then.